Welcome to Far Realms Radio. I'm Skylar.
And I'm Justin.
This is our podcast of many things,
where we give you eldritch advice to improve your Dungeons & Dragons games.
Let's dive in. So this is episode 10. Welcome to episode 10 of Far Realms Radio. Today we're going to talk about what makes a good adventure.
Oh man, this is a tough one.
So let's start with what is an adventure? You know, I mean, and maybe that's a naive question, but like let's cover it from the start, in your opinion.
An adventure, I think, is a really hard word to define. It's one of those things where if you're trying to define it, you can almost always find an example that breaks that definition, and you can almost always come up with one. We often tend to look at it in terms of it being a kind of story because there's so many narrative factors in your common adventure, and that's how we tend to think about it because that's the story we tell after we play.
Like a movie or like a video game has a story.
Exactly, right? The story is what comes out of the game, right? We get the story out of the game from playing it, and then we talk about it afterwards.
Right.
But I think it's important to like understand that it's not strictly a story. If you're a DM and you're like, I have a really good story to tell, I'm like, ooh, well, you're going to have a lot of players who are going to fuck up that story for you.
Not the way to go.
And also, like, if you have a good story, like, why do you need players? Why do you need to play the game? Just go write the story and enjoy that. But for me, the way I look at an adventure, I was thinking about this and read a bunch of different articles and thought about it again. I really see it as a series of self-contained potential plot points, right? That you build around a central tension or a conflict. And this is something that the characters might experience in the game, right? Generally when they are trying to achieve whatever goal that they have set to deal with that tension.
Yeah, I like to think of it as the activity of the night. You know, so
in that character's life, or more
for the players,
as well.
For everybody who's coming, that the adventure is like a board game. It's the thing that we're going to do tonight. And, when friends come over for board game night, then, so-and-so brought a new board game. Let's try that. Oh, I went to Gen Con. I got a new board game. Let's try that. Oh, let's play Eldritch Horror. It's our classic favorite. It'll give us 4 hours of time and has some crunchy bits and whatever. We like the Pandemic, Pandemic Legacy. So instead of Pandemic Legacy or any of these competing products, ours is what we're going to do tonight. It's the adventure. And it might be a one-shot or it might be one that we've been doing for a while, a serial. But I think of it very much as the activity of the evening. So
more on a player level, and you think of it less on a game level.
That's right.
Like, because it's not something that's specific to D&D for you. It's just a gaming experience.
Well, it's the gaming experience, and D&D has its specific way of realizing that. And I think of it as the activity of the evening from both the DM side and the player side. And the DM, I think of it as, okay, this is the thing that we're going to play tonight, so does it give us at the table all that we need to be able to have a good time? Or, as the DM, do I need to supplement it with anything that will make sure that we have a good time with this adventure tonight? And as a player, I think about it as, okay, I have this avatar of myself, and is this adventure going to let me get what I want out of this game that I've built my character to be able to do?
So the simplest definition for you is something that happens.
It's the evening activity. It's the activity we're going to do that day or that game time. Yeah, something that happens. It's
something
what we're
is going to
together.
happen.
Yeah, it's like we're going to come over and play backgammon, or we're going to come over and play chess, or Go, or D&D.
Yeah, I don't know if I would consider those to be adventures in the sense that we're talking about what makes a good adventure in D&D, though.
Well, that's why I qualified with what I expect it to be able to do. A good adventure, in my opinion.
It's more about the experience that you elicit from.
That's right.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I mean,
you're more about the end result than what the structure or definition of that adventure may be.
I think that the structure helps us get to a good end result, but like you and I have talked about it a number of times, for my money, if I'm going to spend money on a game accessory of some kind, I want it to be one that's going to give me and the people I'm hanging out with entertainment. And that might be a Smash Brothers video game, and that might be an adventure module.
I guess, yeah. So to parse it down, your goal is to elicit a certain emotional state for those involved in the game, right? Yeah. I guess that is kind of the point of a good adventure, right? You're trying to get to that emotional state of saying, wow, that was fucking great.
Right, exactly. And that might be a particular story that I think everybody will like, or it might be a particular mechanic I think everybody will have fun with playing with, depending on the group and the mood. But that's the quote-unquote adventure. It's at a very meta level for me. It's at a player level.
Gotcha. Yeah, for me, I just parse down like what is the most simple, usable definition.
So, and there are different structures for different ones, right? But they do all have some commonality between an adventure, even if it's a sandboxy one versus like a story-heavy one or whatever else.
Like if we go into a store, download off the DM's Guild, what is it going to look like? What's that structure going to be? Because that's, it's helpful to know that, because if you pick up an adventure, that's probably how it's going to be structured.
Right. And anyone you get anywhere is going to have a bunch of preamble and maybe Easter eggs or context or a foreword or whatever, most of which is not really required reading. But there are some things that you are going to need in any given adventure. And the hallmarks are typically, they all have an introduction, right, where it just gives you basically your synopsis, your summary. They're going to give you all of this is what's in this in these pages.
Sometimes it's even right at the bottom of the cover. Right on the front cover, it'll say like a 5th edition D&D adventure across the wastelands of Char for characters level 5 to 7, and then it might even be like meant to be completed in 6 to 8 hours of play.
I just want to say, on the few adventures that say how long it's meant to be completed in, please kudos, please keep doing that. Please keep adding that as a thing, even though it's inaccurate. But please keep doing it.
A very wide range.
It is, but it gives you a good sense of how many nights that's going to get you. From the perspective of the player who's like, this is our activity for the evening. I look at 6 to 8 hours of play and I go, that's 1 or 2 sessions.
Yeah. I look at it going, oh, maybe they play tested it.
Yeah, right.
Maybe.
Maybe they play tested it.
If they credit playtesters in the credits, I'm like, yes.
Actually, I think adventures in D&D don't do that, and I really wish Wizards did.
It's mostly DM Guild stuff where I see that,
right.
For sure. That's definitely one that you'll see. I think that little introduction on the front and sometimes the synopsis on the back are honestly the most useful things to read.
Yeah.
Because we all know the adventure background is usually the fucking worst.
It is. Like the adventure background is what the author thought / the editor thought that you, the DM, need to know.
So you can appreciate their genius.
Before you run this. And in practice, that's true maybe half the time. And probably less than that. The adventure background, if you are one of those people, and there's no shame in this, who's just like, I'd like to read all the things because I'm going to read all the things, then great. This is for you. It's a small little blurb of whatever for you, I guess. But from a practical perspective of running the game at the table and what you need to do to prep, it often really doesn't matter.
No, it's so much better if it's just basic, and it's just like super concise information on what conflicts might occur. Something that you as the DM, you kind of have an idea of how the plot's going to move forward a little bit from that point.
Right, which is what the adventure synopsis, I think, does better.
And you don't need, to enjoy The Lord of the Rings, you don't need to go study the Elvish scripts that Tolkien wrote in his other books. You don't need the Silmarillion. You don't need to read that. You can really enjoy The Lord of the Rings without it.
So these are 3 common sections that you're going to find. You're also going to find one usually that has a call out for important NPCs. I'm of split mind about this. Either include the NPC right where you meet them, or have an index in the back. The problem with the index in the back is now you're flipping back and forth to that stat block every time you use it.
That drives me nuts.
Right, but when the other side of that coin is if you include the stat block right where you're going to use it, if that character survives elsewhere, now you have to flip back and forth to that page and remember what it is.
I found I kind of like having it with each encounter as I go through. If there's multiple encounters in the adventure, I like having the map and the relevant stat blocks kind of near where that encounter actually happens, not in the back, not in an appendix. It's so annoying to have to flip back and forth. It's not a big a deal if you actually have physical paper because you can have the map out and kind of read through. But when I go through and I'm reading like, okay, room 7, and I have to scroll down to the map and I'm like, okay, what room is room 7? What does it look like? It just creates this, it makes it more difficult to read through the adventure and visualize it, at least for me personally.
I agree. The Wizards adventures are sort of notorious in this regard. And this is also just about layout generally. The other thing you're going to see is a bunch of encounters, scenes, acts, chapters, basically a division of whatever their structure is for this content and how you're supposed to consume it. And there are certain ones that are laid out better than others. I've yet to see one that's a true sandbox that's laid out really well. Even in other brands like Pathfinder, it's just a hard thing to lay out.
It's a hard thing to lay out.
But one of the things about the D&D brand ones that we use in this edition is that you basically have to read the entire adventure to understand how it's supposed to run. So, word to the wise. You're going to go with some of the officially published licensed content, or you're going to run, organized play kind of thing. You got to read the whole thing. You can't just Even if you're pressed for time,
Well,
you know, you got to make time for it.
The funny thing is, though, like, you don't... When I run an adventure that I pick up, I don't, like, sit down and read the whole adventure. You don't really have to. You just have to read enough for what you're going to use that night, right? Like, you don't sit down...
you say that, but you try and run Ravenloft that way? I know.
Yeah, but I'm saying, you know, that's true. You have to know some background. But hopefully you're able to get that from the synopsis and the summary and all of that, how much you really need to know.
One would hope.
Like, because there's so many times you see, like, oh, make sure you read all of this. And, like, I fucking don't, because I don't need to. Like, I'm not going to sit down and read the whole 20 pages in one go. Like, I'm going to read half of it to kind of know. I'll look at the back to see what the end result is, right? I need to know what the possible end of the adventures might be so that I can figure out what's important as we move forward so I don't shoot myself in the foot, you know, with an NPC or something, or a secret. But,
which, if the adventure is organized well, is easy to do.
Yeah.
And Paizo is really good at this, and they're not the only ones. Kobold Press does a good job too. Monty Cook has for a while. I think that this is an area that Wizards has gotten better, and D&D has gotten better at the published content over the years. It's still not where I want it to be. And I think that the content you find in the DMs Guild today is going to be a better reflection of that kind of content.
There's someone out there that does a better job than Wizards in some of those categories,
in my opinion,
for sure.
The bar is not high in layout in this case. But it's fine, you know. Like, once you have grokked the adventure that they'll publish from D&D, then you know all of the scenes. You can wrap your head around the encounters. What are they? The scenes, the acts, how it ties together.
The big thing is kind of figuring out, how it fits together, like how you might flow from one encounter or scene to another, like how those may end up connecting. And that's kind of like what you have to play to find out. You know, that's the point.
Which makes the last section type of thing you're going to see in the book, the maps, stat blocks, all the extra resources, appendices, all that stuff. That's where it gets useful.
Yep. I prefer a lot of the time if it's also interjected earlier in the text along where you might need it if it's a longer text.
Don't give me a book without a table of contents. I will fight you.
Yeah, it's not hard, guys. You can do it. You can do it.
Really?
So, those are kind of what you'll see in the structure of the adventure. An intro, a background, usually some kind of synopsis, including important NPCs, and then you'll come through the encounters and all the extra stuff like maps, stat blocks, and appendix in the back.
Well, so let's talk about what types of adventures there are, right? Because we've qualified from what we use them for, how we view what an adventure is, and what the composition of it is. But there's you can have two adventures that have the same structure and both be adventures and be totally different. And it's because they're different types of adventures, right? And here I'm talking about things like, is it an event-based adventure? Is it a site-based adventure or something else? So let's dig into what types of adventures what there are, broad categories for the kinds that we see out in the wild. I think that probably the easiest one to wrap your mind around first is the event-based adventure, which is very much like it sounds. This event happens, and then based on the result of that event, another set of events could happen. It's not bound by usually time or place. It's trigger-based, and you can think of it very much like a TV show or a movie. When a scene happens, something resolves in the scene, there's a conflict or some choice that the characters in this case the players, have to make, and then based on the choices they make, we accelerate to the next thing. We don't worry about necessarily how they get there. Did they take a car? Did they take a carriage? Did they take a horse? Did they fly? Doesn't matter. Unless there's something relevant like an encounter that might happen on the way.
You switch locations like Law and Order. Donk, donk.
Right, exactly. And now you're in a new scene.
Doesn't matter how you got there.
And you got there however makes the most sense for you to get there. Whatever. It's not part of the story. And these ones tend to be a little more story-focused. I think the best ones present players with complicated choices that don't have clear answers. And multiple events, so it's not just like this happens, then that happens, then that happens. It's this happens, then one of these three things happen, and like it becomes a flowchart. Site-based adventures, by contrast, are your sort of classic dungeon crawl. You go to a place. It might be a murder mystery in a big mansion. It might be you found an ancient tomb full of skeletons and you explore it. And the difference is that rather than the events controlling the pacing of the adventure and the players navigating the pacing by how quickly and the way in which they solve the events, in here it's explicit. Each event is a room, it's a door, it's a place. It's some part of the place they're in, the site. Even if the site is, let's say, an old college, an old university, they go over to that building. That's a series of other sites in that one once they get in the door. But we can break it out into this sort of more broad site-based, where are they and what is in there, and then how do they deal with that? Oftentimes, there's a lot of backtracking from one part of this site to another part of the site.
Back to town, back to the dungeon.
Maybe back to the town, maybe to the place where there's a door you couldn't unlock now that you found the key after you killed the basilisk, whatever. But it's a little more free form. It gives the players a little more agency in how they choose to solve this content.
What led you to where does this distinction of like event-based versus site-based, that framework come from? Where does it come from?
It comes from Monty Cook. I think this is back in the days of 3rd edition and 3.5. It may have been Eric Mona. I don't remember. Back then they worked together quite a lot, and Monty Cook did publishing before Monty Cook Games took off and became the thing it is today. And they talked about the different kinds of adventures, and they did it because it was when digital publishing and PDFs online were still sort of nascent compared to where they are. So you wanted to be able to categorize them because there's another type that's in there too. And people who love event-based adventures don't tend to like this other type of the spectrum, this last sort of side of it, which is the sandbox. And the inverse is true too. So a sandbox is the way we describe an adventure that feels kind of like you're a kid in a sandbox. You can do whatever you want. It's a big open
interactive world. You can
site,
kind of, it's a living, breathing world. You kind of do whatever you want.
It might be like a kingdom. It might be the whole world or a continent, depending upon the scale of what you want to do and how much work the DM is willing to do.
And usually what you'll hear this be compared to is like railroading, or, sometimes that's the angle people will take to explain sandboxing.
I think that's actually a poor way to describe it. Like event-based is the one that people often accuse of railroading.
The binary explanation people will give.
Sandbox or railroading, right. And it's far too simplistic an explanation. So, let's touch on railroading for a moment because it's a good counter to talk about sandboxing. And to players who like sandbox-style adventures where you have a wide kingdom with which to choose whatever your motivations are and pursue them at your leisure and build things that you want to build, more like a simulation. Often when those players play in an event-based adventure, they feel railroaded because their choices are limited and they want to, have some other kind of thing. So this goes back to like knowing what your players want and choosing based upon what your players want, which of these different types of adventures that you want as well. And a lot of this thinking came out of the discussions around how do you railroad versus not railroad? Is railroading good sometimes? Yeah. And I'll give you an example. Half-Life, the very first one, actually all the Half-Life games.
They're linear as
fuck.
They're
completely linear.
You're on rails the whole time.
And we love it because it's really good content.
Dude, there's literally a Dreamcast game where you're on rails the whole game and you shoot at things and people still love it.
Right.
It can literally be on rails. People will still like it.
So railroading is not necessarily a bad thing.
I agree.
And do not take that, of course,
it's not
internet.
necessarily the opposite of sandboxing
Correct. You can railroad somebody in a sandbox too, depending upon what's going on. But regardless, so these are the different types broadly that you can have.
It's interesting because for me, like I look at these, but I just have like essentially different names for them. The way I've looked at it, and rather than be like event-based, site-based, or like sandbox, I look at it as just more narrative influence in the style of play over time, right? Because like we always talk about the classic dungeon crawl adventures. And that's because the narrative, we were coming from war games, the narrative controls weren't in there as heavily, right? You mentioned there was an old spooky manor on the edge of town, and the players are like, well, we know what we're doing. Let's go. There's some treasure in there.
Right.
There wasn't this ambiguity of, oh, but my character's motivations. Oh, but this. Oh, but what if I want to socialize with the townsfolk? It was much more, and I don't want to say hack and slash, but it was much more in terms of you had assumption that the players would take this mission and go and do the adventure. There was less narrative. Like players weren't worried. It was more mechanic, right? Like you were saying, like each room, it's very mechanical.
Yeah, exactly. It depends upon the player expectations, right? Like a sandboxy type adventure is going to be you can progress at your leisure. Do you want to explore the manor? When do you want to come back to town?
I think
how do you want to manage resources?
You were saying, it's just a matter of more or less like narrative influence.
Versus an event-based adventure, you're going to explore. There's some reason that calls your players to the manor at the end of town, and then the door mysteriously closes behind you, locking you all within.
Of course,
one of you is a murderer.
You have to prevent them from going back. That's a big part of an adventure. There has to be the point of no return.
Well, for an event-based adventure in particular, right? It's always moving forward. Whereas the sandbox, you can do basically.
And I think part of that is if you look at what story structures are the most analogous to those, you can kind of see like a big part of a story is usually there's this point of no return where you can't just go back. The hero can't go back to town.
Right.
That you've got like to the point of no return. You have to keep going now.
Yeah. So I like to think of it when I'm talking about the different categories of people as on the spectrum, you have an event-based adventure is kind of like a murder mystery show. Mm-hmm. A site-based adventure is kind of like maybe it's a specific a horror show. You're trapped in a manor somewhere and you have to escape. And a sandbox is more like playing SimCity.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't really see. For me, the sandbox is just a series of site and event-based adventures
You
organized geographically.
Which comes to the next point is as our thinking in game design has continued to evolve, and we've had now a whole swath, a decade plus, I guess, of Paizo putting out regular adventures for a D&D compatible game. Wizard stepping up and putting out a lot of content as well. Now we've started to mix and match them. Eberron was one of the first ones that did this. It would have a series of very pulpy, event-based, you are on a train, it's a murder mystery, and the train deposits you at a site, and you have to now explore this ancient temple. And, well, how do you categorize that adventure? Is it railroady or isn't it? And what can you run for organized play, or when you buy it,
we're literally on a train.
Right. Yes. Right. I mean, it's literally like a railroad. So
exactly.
I think that
you can always find an exception.
I think that part of what makes this game fun and what makes a good adventure, in my opinion, is that it has the ability to mix and match these different types, so that there are maybe over the course of an evening or a couple of evenings, some site-based things you can do, some event-based things you can do. It really helps the world feel alive when there's a mixture, because it doesn't always feel like we can predict what's going to happen next as players.
Definitely. Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. But for me, it's funny because I tend to look at it more, probably how most people tend to look at it is adventures in terms of their scope and their length, really, has to be one of the ways we talk about it the most, in terms of, is it a module, a scenario, a one-shot? Is it a campaign or a box set? Is it like a homebrew world that's been going for 20 years?
Right.
I feel like that's a big place, like a big talking point of how we talk about these things, as well as difficulty in the form of character level or setting.
I mean, it's one of the things that's required discussion in my session 0, basically, where we sit down and I'm like, all right, into how I plan. This is why I say it's an accessory at the table. And one of the things I say is this is a level 1 to 15. And, we're in Out of the Abyss right now, 1 to 15. They don't tell us on that one. This is why I'm such a fan of modules are like, this is this many sessions or this many hours,
I need a scale that's more familiar to the game.
I knew with Paizo stuff, for instance, in their adventure paths, they put out one every month, and there are 2 a year. So it's like every 6 months you have a complete story. But having run a few of them, it'll take you a year to 2 years to get all the way through, depending on how often you meet, once a week or twice a week, and for how many hours. With this one, and the classic metric you go back to is, okay, levels 1 to 15. So that's a little more coarse-grained, for like, what's the scope of the adventure? But it does tell you still how long it can take, right? You go, okay, levels 1 to 15 is going to take us over a year, and probably it's the same as Paizo, probably less than 2, but because it's D&D and it has a different pace than other games do, I would say maybe closer to the 2 side. And then a lot of it depends upon how the players short-circuit various things, right? But, there are all different scopes and lengths, right? There's one of my favorite type of adventures I learned about for the first time when I went to Gen Con years and years ago, which is a one-shot. Like an actual legitimate, not just let's do a one-shot, let's come up with a homebrew because we have some friends in town and we want to play D&D in this normal day or whatever, or we're going to run this particular encounter because one-shots weren't always a thing. It was... this is an adventure that's designed specifically for a 4-hour time slot. Mm-hmm. And it's designed with some constraints, like it has an A, B, C act, 3-act structure or whatever, and part of that came also out of organized play for how to get people interested and they want to show up and participate in all these kinds of things. All the way ranging to like a box set, you buy like a big box set that has a bunch of adventures in it and it's a whole campaign maybe for multiple characters, and now you see like the game industry has kind of gone more toward Gloomhaven and these kinds of games.
It's been cool to see some box sets come back, especially for like beginner sets. Like, I think that's really, really a good idea.
I think that box sets that have more than one adventure in them, that give you like, here's your intro adventure, and then there's like maybe 2 others, and then you graduate.
Yeah, that's
great. Super good. I love
that.
Like it's enough to really feel like you got your money out of that toy.
Definitely. Basically. Yeah, it's been interesting to watch one-shots become such a thing as cons become more of a thing, because that's, like you said, that's pretty much where it evolved out of that. And like when you get together with friends you don't see all the time, or your old gaming group or something, right? When time is limited. And I think there's a lot of good things we've learned about adventure writing from one-shots, and there's a lot of people out there who aim to like kind of run each of their session like it's a one-shot, so that it has those up and down and narrative beats and like that kind of that like narrative structure almost. You don't always want to do that though, because some of the advantages of having a long running campaign is you can use more long-form narrative things like lots of foreshadowing or recurring stuff, motifs and whatnot. But it's been kind of cool to see the rise of one-shots. I still, as like kind of a grognard, like look at one-shots, I go, oh, that's cool. It's not as good as a campaign though, so we're going to play a campaign, right?
Right. Yeah.
Like, unless it's like a new game to try out, or it's like a silly one shot, or like, it's an event for some reason. I'm like, but we could also just play a campaign and that'd be better.
Just sink our teeth in. I think that there's a holy grail here, and it does exist in some cases. I think that some of the third-party material for 3rd edition had this. It was really where I first saw it, is that you can have a series of one-shots that stitch together very well to form a cohesive campaign. And maybe in a published product kind of line, I would look at, for Eberron, in 3rd edition, they had, I think, Whispers of the Last War, Shadows of the Last War, is a 4-adventure adventure path. And they were shorter adventures, and then they were divided up in such a way that you could take any one of their set pieces. Each adventure was just a collection of 3 or so set pieces, and you could take any one of those set pieces out and use it as a one-shot for a night. And that was great. It's sort of this like very easy, digestible, both from a DM and a player perspective, and it has a cohesive thread through the entire thing. So why this is good is because if a player shows up, you can easily integrate them. If they're going to miss a session, you can easily deintegrate them and pull them back later. It's very modular in a way that makes running the game easy, and that means you don't have to worry about, that character's just off screen for right now.
Yeah, definitely.
So let's talk about, setting in adventure and how much, what parts of it matter, what it serves for the adventure itself and for the game.
Because a lot of the time, especially in that adventure background area, there's just too much unnecessary setting and information.
Right.
Players don't care about what's over the next hill. They only care about what's in front of them, and that's really only what matters. Like you just said, what's on screen, right? Like, like maybe this is happening because of all this events and this world history, but that really doesn't matter usually in the adventure you're going to run.
Yeah, I mean, in film and theater, we say show, don't tell. And a lot of writing about a setting for an adventure is a lot of tell. And this is, I think, why art is so compelling for both DMs and players, and why it's useful to show players art, because it's very literally, this is what you see. And it's a compelling thing. You save yourself so much time in doing that.
Yeah. And like, for example, like it doesn't need to say like, oh, and everyone here is mad because the Knights of Ren did this. You can just put in like one of the important NPCs area, like this character hates the Knights of Ren because of whatever. Like, and that's way more useful because it's that character specific, rather than like putting that in the adventure background where it may not even be important. You may not have to address that at all. Unless they talk to that NPC over there. That's where it becomes relevant.
This is something I think 5e did actually rather well. When you're in a new environment, and it's not adventure specific, they did it site specific within adventure or whatever you might be. They have a sidebar, a call out with environmental features. And the setting is mostly going to be that, right?
Yeah.
What's the environment in which we're in? And that might be, okay, the knights of such and such don't like us, so avoid them. They're bad guys. But mostly it's also going to be, is it cold? Do I have to worry about weather?
Yeah.
Do I have to worry about food? Do I have to worry about what?
Location is a big part of setting. Definitely. And I like how Slyfarge talks a lot about having a fantastic location, meaning having a location that has some like kind of memorable, fantastic features.
Yep.
John Four from Role Playing Tips also has some really good stuff on how to make a location quote unquote memorable, right? And without going into it, kind of like the things that will describe a place but actually be memorable, not just like throwaway. Yeah.
Right. A real set piece that's not just it doesn't just feel like an encounter generator spat out a thing and there you go.
Yeah, exactly.
Something memorable, I think, is a good way to think about it. But there's a lot of stuff that doesn't matter in a setting or can be readily changed. And I like to think about it as either there's really two parts to it. Either there's the serial numbers of a setting and an adventure, and then there's the window dressing. And the serial numbers are things like, if I want an Eberron adventure or maybe a Star Wars adventure, but I don't want to have to deal with stormtroopers, or I don't have to deal with the Empire, then I would scratch off those particular serial numbers and say, all right, let's take the stat block for a shock trooper, stormtrooper, or something like that, and let's use that instead. Or in Eberron, so instead of Warforged, they're golems. And you just like change the flavor part of it. And then the window dressing is mostly around, what do the buildings look like, right? Can I take a city from, and here's a great example. I have for 3rd edition a World of Darkness source book on a city, on a vampire city. And it does a really good job, and it's for D20. It does a really good job of walking you through the ins and outs of that setting, of the city, of the players, the factions you have to deal with, the characters and their motivations, how players interact with it. There's another one that Monty Cook put out as well back in yesteryear, which was Tallus. And it's like a big 800-page source book on a city built with the assumptions of 3rd edition D&D. And it's really great to change the window dressing, change the name, change whatever, take the structure of the city, the maps that they have, and the kinds of things that are in each location, that's all window dressing, and then plop it in wherever you need it.
Oh, yeah. Reskinning things and learning to reuse and pick and take what you want is one of the most important skills, I think, of being a DM these days, because you have so many cool resources. You can do so much less work if you're just willing to like change a few things. And a lot of the time when you first start, you feel like there's this right and this wrong way to do it in the D&D narrative or things like that. But it doesn't really matter.
It doesn't.
Like, you can just take that stat block and it's a pirate stat block. Well, now it's an orc pirate. Like, what needs to change? Maybe throw a feature in there on the stat block. You're done. Like, it's just a series of statistics and abilities. Like, reskinning is super important, I think, especially for a good adventure. You can reskin it in a lot of different ways. It'll probably still be good. You're just changing the like ice cream's good. Unless you really hate that flavor, I'm probably still going to eat it.
Right.
It's probably still good.
So one of the things that the setting and the adventure does for you that is really useful is it's a shorthand for tone. So when you talk about the setting, if I say something like, this adventure we're going to run is in Eberron, and that means that people who don't know what that means can go look up online or wherever they want some quick and easy information about the tone. They'll know, oh, okay, so this is going to be a pulpy adventure. It's going to be probably a lot of action adventure. It probably is going to be a lot of globe-trotting. And modern sensibilities and kind of questioning our place in industrial society.
So it could also be very noir.
Yes. But if I say Ravenloft, that doesn't mean noir in that way. It means
Gothic horror.
It means Gothic horror. If I say Forgotten Realms, it's highest fantasy, So it's really useful as far as tone. Like, highest fantasy story is basically a power fantasy. You are going to get more powerful. You're going to have demons and extraplanar madness. You're going to face that stuff. If I say the Underdark, that means you can say that it's going to be hard. There are going to be a lot of evil people. It's your shorthand.
Drow.
Yeah.
Drow. There's always drow down there.
Fuck those guys.
Yeah.
And I think that really, it's easy to lean into that too much, especially as a DM. You want to convey a certain feel to the characters,
but only just as much as you need.
It's not as much as you need to get their characters that look like they belong in that setting.
It's like box text. Like, after a sentence or two, their eyes are going to glaze over.
Right.
So it really needs to be a couple strong features or bits of things that set that tone for you, and just lean into those. So, do a few things well will do so much for you.
If I was going to describe the Iron Kingdoms as a setting for how minimal I feel about this, I would say the Iron Kingdoms is a diesel punk setting with giant stompy robots and big knights with big swords and magic that's also tech. And then let them run with it.
And just kind of go with however they perceive it.
Exactly. Forgotten Realms is a high fantasy setting where nothing is impossible and nothing is too weird.
I think a big part of running a good adventure is being willing to be flexible on the themes and stuff a little bit. Because you have to be because the game needs to be about your players' enjoyment, not necessarily about everyone's enjoyment, but when the DM makes the game so much more about the story they want to tell than about what the players want to explore, that's where you lose it. That's where you lose everything.
This is why I think it's important to keep the setting tone clear and brief, because it allows them to have hooks into it very easily for their characters. So they can find something they can latch into, a very generic thing, and then you can deepen it with them if they want.
Yeah.
Which brings me to the next part of the thing that the setting will get you. I think the other big boon is the mood. Which is, it's like the flip side of the tone. If the tone is the feel of the story that we're going to tell, the mood is the feel of the characters who are in that story.
Gotcha.
Or adventure or sandbox, right? And
kind of like the Malo.
Yeah.
So if we're talking about like noir as the theme, then that kind of tells you it's a shorthand for a bunch of things. Like, there's going to be smoking and black and white talk over scenes and hats.
That would all be tone, in my opinion. Mood would be, is it a noir story that has characters who are glitzy and glammy and shiny feeling?
No, they're always petty.
Not always. Well, I mean, they might be petty, but they also all be glitzy and glammy. Or is it a noir story that has existential crisis? Or is it about loss? You know, the mood really is about the motivations of the characters, and the setting will give you some of that because it'll give you background hooks. It'll give you some sense of what kinds of people live in this area. You know, so you're not going to have either a noir tone or questions about existential places in industrial society if your setting is a very rural backwater in the middle of nowhere in the Forgotten Realms.
Exactly. Yeah, kind of. What you can do with the mood is kind of determined by your theme, right?
Right.
You're not going to do like a super grimdark, serious thing in like a My Little Pony themed game, but I'm sure there's somebody doing that right now.
I mean, it requires a lot more work, you know, and that's where the setting can give you it's like a shorthand for these
I say
things.
That, but there's someone out there doing that, having a great time.
Because of the internet.
Like, okay, cool.
So one of the things I also like about an adventure, I think that maybe is the strongest adventures have this for you. The writers have given some thought into what this looks like, which is a strong start.
Oh yes, so important.
You know,
it's definitely something I picked up from reading Mike Shea's Sly Flourish stuff in the Lazy DM. He talks a lot about how having a strong start to a session and how important that is. And what I picked up from that is when in doubt, start with combat.
Yes, in media res.
People all of a sudden, they pay attention, there's stakes.
There's immediate threat.
Boom.
Yeah, so a strong start, you know, and it can...
And it doesn't have to be in media res, but like, you know, like... Don't be afraid to throw it in there real early.
Yeah, I mean, it can be also in the middle of a fight.
Totally.
And you don't have to give all the players direct information. You can say, all right, the game starts, and some adventures will do this. Everybody is rolling initiative. And then the next round, you tell them that you're on a train and you're hurtling through the air or whatever, you know. You start it right off with processing information a lot and trying to make meaningful decisions right away, as opposed to trying to find a way for everybody to get together. You know, the players will be like, what's the conflict? Why are we not already together? Or why are we, you know, having a strong start where they already have something that they can work toward. Obviously, survival is a good, easy one, but it doesn't have to be. It might be a courtroom. It might be an argument. It might be when you just got kicked out of wizard school.
It could be a chase scene. That's a common one.
Chase scenes are great.
Every James Bond movie ever.
And this I think is a really good way to exercise some easy and cheap tricks as a DM, which is using things like kicking in the door, having ninjas or zombies or whatever kick in the door and cause an automatic fight.
Yep.
You know, a good example might be you have a bunch of players who are maybe nobility, and there's a very tense negotiation going on with two newlyweds. I don't know, I'm making this up. And, you know, that's where you lay out the framework, and then you start the session, and like there's like a round of talking, and then somebody kicks in the door, and ninjas attack, assassins arrive, and you're automatically off to the races. And now, not only do they have to defend their own lives, but also the other NPCs who they may or may not want to live, whatever.
Yeah.
You know, very strong, very memorable. You don't have to worry about, like, how do you know each other in the tavern? How do I get you to go over to that table?
No.
And, I mean,
please don't start in a tavern. Please don't.
One of the other things I learned from T20 Star Wars that was really actually quite useful, and I think it was where we premiered this in role playing generally, and it has taken off since then, is using cutscenes as fodder for this kind of stuff. So in the context of Star Wars, D20 Star Wars of yesteryear, they would say things like start off a session and sprinkle them periodically with a cutscene of the Star Destroyer bridge,
yep.
And you have the Admiral say, deploy the troops, you know, and then you cut back to the players who are racing along a platform and they have no context for when or where that's going to happen or anything like that. You know, as the DM, you have a lot of control for these kind of narrative things, and it's scary sometimes because, you know, you don't want like players to glaze over, and they will if it's too long. But it is also a very good, like, you get their imagination going fast.
It's definitely a cutscene, and games that focus more on making it feel like a TV show or a narrative of that style usually provide methods for that. But you'll see it a lot. Like, I think Adam Coble is a DM who does a good job of that, and he'll be like, you know, just like for a second, we cut away from the heroes and we see a dark figure in a robe and a chair. And then he says, and you go kind of from there. And like, you don't provide a lot of context. Anime does this so well.
Very well.
Every freaking anime, you will see like the dark outline, or comics do this too, of some new hero or villain. You don't know who it is, and they're like always in the dark. And then they have this big reveal later on. One Piece does this all the time. Every anime ever does this.
It's a good theatrical trick, and you can use it at your table too.
Definitely. But yeah, the cutscenes are great. It's also a great way to maybe have the big boss, if you're using that kind of mechanic in your campaign, a big bad. Your players can see who it is. They can get an idea of why they may dislike him or whatever, without having to suddenly be like character level 1 interacting with like a level 15 boss who just wipes the floor with them, right? No one likes losing or surrendering. So it's a kind of a good way for them to see how terrible or however this person is at a distance.
I want to say something that's maybe controversial, but shouldn't be, which is that this extends to players too. So when something happens, you start the session or or it's your turn or whatever it is, players should feel like always, in my opinion, at the table, they have the ability to take agency and cut away. Then the player could say, I cut away. And then my character was over here talking to this person some years ago, and that person says this thing and hands him this knife. Cut back to the scene. My character pulls the knife and lunges at the orc.
Yeah, that's a flashback mechanic. You see that in Blades in the Dark. It's pretty cool there. Yeah, you can do like a flashback mechanic.
Like Blades in the Dark is a good example of where this has gone and been enshrined in rules. D&D doesn't have anything like that, but that doesn't mean you can't just do it.
Totally, you can just hack it or take it, and it's been cool to kind of see these ideas evolve into mechanics in new game designs. But where I tend to find that works best in D&D is when you do kind of downtime or leisure time, where you're maybe going to fast forward time forward a little bit, and that's where I usually ask my players, like, okay, is there anything you want to do specifically in this time? Like, you have a whole day in town, is there anything you want to do? And that's where you're good at taking that opportunity, because that's where I give the opportunity for the montage or the like little bit or the cutscene, because that's perfect.
But downtime is not what I would say is a strong start.
No, don't, not as a strong start, not at all. This is a good point. We're getting away from the strong start.
Right. So I mean, I guess if I bring it up because you want to have a strong start, and cutscenes and playing with the audience's mind, and the audience is the other players at your table, both DM and other players, actual players. Taking their imagination on a little bit of a ride is a strong start. It's a good way to help them anchor you and what you wanted to get out of this, and make it a memorable experience, which is really, in my opinion, what it's all about. That's why I come back to that it's the activity of the night.
Yeah. Strong start gets you momentum.
All right, so I've been yammering a lot about various stuff. I think it's time to stop into this tavern that we have strolled by and take a little brew.
Let's do it.
All right, so here we are in Tavern Talk, and this week...
This is the part of the show where we toast to you, our awesome listeners.
Our lovely listeners, and we do have a promo we're going to talk about at the very end, but we chose an adventurous beer. Adventurous. I just made up that word.
I like it.
And it's the Campfire Stout, High Water Brewing Campfire Stout.
I like it because it tastes like s'mores.
It says, leaves you wanting s'more.
Usually I'm not huge on overly too sweet, but I think this one does a pretty good job tasting like s'mores.
Stout brewed with graham crackers and molasses with natural beer flavor added. Campfire Stout evokes fond memories of wilderness and camping adventures. I mean, I like this because when the first time I tasted it, it was unconventional. I hadn't had a beer have a smoky and yet kind of malty s'mores taste like that. Yeah. But it's not saccharine like some of the ones I've had who are in the same Campfire Stout are just too much.
Too sweet. If it's too sweet, I'm not a huge fan.
Yeah.
This one's kind of nice because it has kind of a sweet start, and then the smokiness takes over.
It does, and it feels really kind of charred is not quite the right word for it. It's roasty.
Yeah,
I guess
toasty.
Yeah,
you're toasting marshmallows. You're toasting and roasting. Yeah. Where's this one? Where's this High Water Brewing at?
This is from...
I think I see a California on the back.
You do see a California on the back. I'm looking for where they talk about where the NorCal something... It doesn't say... It's got to say somewhere.
Well, we chose
San Jose.
No, my hometown.
Your hometown.
Oh, well, I'm so proud.
Highwaterbrewing.com.
Not a lot of actual bears there, but hey. But hey, that's guys. I chose this one because it had adventures in the description, right? Mm-hmm. And it leaves you wanting some more. And that's what a good adventure should do a little bit too.
It does. We'll talk about that when we come back, I guess. That's one of the last things we're talking about, ending an adventure.
But first, I think we should talk about our next giveaway since we've been away for a couple of weeks.
Right. So we're going to launch a new promo, I think, for the end of the year. New year, new dice.
New year, new dice. You need an excuse for more dice? We got your back.
We got your back, and we're going to have really quality ones. They're going to be finely crafted metal ones, and they will not only that, but look beautiful.
Yeah, we'll purchase some off of, it's probably going to be Die Hard Dice. We'll throw some pics up on the Twitter.
Yes, indeed.
You guys can see what you're in the running for. And yeah, that's the plan. We'll be putting that contest up on Twitter just like the last one. It will essentially be share a link to the show. Make sure you put the hashtag Farmrooms Radio, and we'll make sure we add you to our list.
So with that, thanks for listening, and let's get back to talking about what makes adventures so great.
Let's do it.
So now we're back, and we were talking about strong starts. And one of the strongest starts that I love is the start to the Two Towers Lord of the Rings movie, the second one. And you may remember that Gandalf, in the first one, we lose him, right? He's spoiler alert.
Oh, spoilers.
He's taken down into the pit by the Balrog. It happens in the book, happens in the movie. It's a tragic moment. Made me cry. It's fine. And then the second movie starts with Gandalf and what happened to him as he's falling through this mountain.
It's a hell of a start, really.
Fighting a Balrog as they fall.
Just falling through the Underdark, fighting a Balrog.
Right,
no big deal.
Right. I mean, it was probably one of the most epic starts to a story that I ever have encountered. It's one of my favorite openings to a film, period. And in the Theater of the Mind, in D&D, at our table, we can absolutely do that. It's a little hard to do vertical falling like that because, the table is not a really great 3D space, but the point being that it's super, super strong, and how really important it is. That creates a hook for us, the audience, and as the DM, I guess if you're running the adventure for your players, that makes it really easy to keep the stakes really high. And that's, I think, what makes part of an adventure also really successful is how you manage the players staying hooked. And that really basically boils down to three things in my mind. One of which is the stakes, another of which is player engagement, both with the DM and across each other, and then also pacing, general pacing.
Okay. Yeah.
You can, and I include pacing in this particularly because you can have the other two nailed. You can have cross-player engagement, both with the DM and also other players amongst themselves, as well as high stakes that motivate them to continue to take action in the world. But if the pacing isn't on, then they'll check out. They'll go off and wander away and come back, and then the session will begin to drag, and everybody feels it, and people start yawning at the table, and you're like, it's only 8:30, guys. Come on. We just sat down an hour and a half ago. What is this? And so let's talk about stakes and managing stakes and how you can keep them high, I think, which is the idea of them. You really want to, stakes, if they're not high stakes, they're not worth it, And I've definitely played games with people who are I would like to have low stakes and build my farm and economy game, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's just not, I think, what's best served by this.
Adventuring usually comes with higher stakes.
Like fantasy adventure game.
You're adventuring life or death situations. Usually that's where you're ending up.
Right. And life or death is a great place to start. You can also start by threatening something that the characters love. Something that they hold dear to them.
Kill the darlings technique.
Right. But that might also be symbolic. Like maybe it's a character starts and wants an ancestral sword, and one of the first things that you do is take that sword away and dangle it in front of them. And it's right there. Maybe they get it, and then they lose it. And they get it. No, you have to actually give it to them. You have to give it to them, which we'll get that into a moment. But the point is that you want the stakes to be just a little bit out of reach, not so that the characters will feel like they can't achieve them, but that they feel like they have to spend a little bit of something, maybe resource, maybe mind power, maybe whatever it is, to get it. That they can get it.
It's usually resource attrition in some way.
Exactly. And this is the carrot methodology. But then as the DM, running the adventure, it's also your job to help them get there. Maybe not too overtly, right? So, okay, you take the ancestral sword. If it's the very first thing you do, then you're going to have this period of not having this thing, and then you have to give it to them, help them get there at some point. And the helping in that case really is when they beat whoever mid-boss took it so that they can have the final showdown with the final boss and their awesome magic sword. You want to help enshrine that moment of recovering the sword as only the DM can running the adventure so that it feels impactful in that moment.
Like it mattered.
Right. Yeah, that really mattered.
Yeah. The funny thing is stakes and just the entire concept of hooking players is something that's a lot more modern in terms of adventures. If you look at old adventures, there's no like explaining like how to hook the players. No. It's assumed like it's a fucking adventure. There's a castle. There's a dragon. Go. Like there's treasure over yonder.
Right.
What hook do you need?
The very first adventure I ran, Firestorm Peak, in 2nd edition, had one hook for one of the players, potentially. And it said that one of the characters would have a family member who went and investigated Firestorm Peak. And that's all. It was like 1 or 2 sentences. And that's
you're
it.
like, so that's cool story, bro.
What about the rest of the characters? Like that's great for one, but we got a party of like 5? You know? They're just like along for the ride. Hey, bro, we're going to help you out, you know?
I mean, yeah. Go that way.
Except that guy's playing an evil character, and that one is a chaotic neutral, you know.
Well, that's the thing, is there's so much more narrative and character-focused things now that the buy-in matters more, right? The stakes and the buy-in actually matter more as we've moved away from war games and more to these character focuses.
I agree. I think that, and I mean, what's interesting about that, just as a quick tangent, is that character focus was what took it away from a war game in the very start.
Oh, of course. You know? Yeah. So we went from nameless units down to like people.
Right. So I think this is the same trajectory that D&D and tabletop has been on forever. It's just we've deepened it more as we've had it longer.
Well, because now we're so worried about like, would my character do this?
So one of the other things I think really works well for helping hook players at the table, it's not just about the character too. It can be about the players. And this is why also I think of an adventure as the board game of the night, so to speak, because cross-player engagement also keeps people at the table and keeps them really engaged. You know, having something that they can play off of, having somebody they can riff with, having somebody that they can solve a problem with, you know, a puzzle or the combat or whatever it is, also is really helpful and helps keep the energy at the table high. It helps keep them invested and interested because everybody's looking for ways to work with the other players to the mutual benefit. And this can be like plot twist cards at a table. It could also be your characters have, this has worked really well in one of the games I ran some years ago where you give them special bonuses for working together at certain things, you know, like team up powers.
Well, the funny thing is, like in D&D, when you really look at just the mechanics, there's not a lot of player-to-player engagement.
No.
There really isn't. There's like, I heal you, I buff you.
Inspiration has one, but it's very minimal.
Really pretty much it. There's not a lot of forced player engagement. Like I've heard it described before as like people all playing solitaire at a table, and sometimes, you know, you could see it that way because it's very different than a game like Magic the Gathering that has like tons of interaction and engagement even in a multiplayer setup. And so it's more of the DM's responsibility, like you just, and that's a great example, is like giving buffs or things for team up moments. And I mean, everyone loves to have like a good team up moment, of course, right? You got to have the cannonball, fastball special, right?
For cross player engagement, there's basically there's basically 3 different kinds, I think, of different ways that players engage from, you know, the DM's perspective and other players' perspective. One of which is something that the player drives, right? Player driven. And this is things like plot twist cards or hero points or fate points or whatever you want. You know,
so some form of like narrative control.
That's right. It's a player initiated move. It's basically the player says, I play this card or I spend this resource I have and I take control for this little piece for a little bit. You know, and it might be a plot point or something like, one of the podcasts I listen to, they do live play and each player has a plot point, which basically lets them grab hold of the narrative, everything involved, and drive it in a total direction that they want, and then they let go. And there's like some of them have an exchange where the DM can veto stuff, but has to spend resources to do it. You know, so you can get complicated here. There's crunch to be had. But that's basically one type you can think of. Like some players really like that agency. We have some at our table who are like, I want the power sometimes to make things to be a chaos monkey.
Yeah. Or sometimes they just like being able to take that director stance, right? Like you would if you were a DM. Because we do play a game with a lot of other game masters. And so I understand wanting to do that, like take that director stance and make this like thing happen because it would be so cool.
Right.
And I think that's kind of nice to be able to hand that agency to players that you know can want to do that.
So another thing that really works well for cross-player engagement that's not player-driven is fomented engagement, and that's usually by the DM. You're running the game, you're running the adventure, you set up a scenario that requires more than one person to solve it. There have to be two levers that be pulled at the same time.
Yeah, of course. When you have like a puzzle or something like that, you force the engagement that way.
Or there's a fight and it has mixed units, right? Ranged and spellcasters and melee. So your melee people can't just plow through it because those guys on the ledge are going to kill them with bows before they get there.
Right.
So you have to think outside the box and
or like the Hydra, like you got to cut and burn
multi-heads. Yeah,
right?
There's enough facets to the problem, whatever it is, that you need more than just one person to solve it. And then the last and one I consider to be some of the most elegant is working across ends amongst the players, and this is represented nominally, I think, in 5e as the factions, right? You have the Zhentarim, you have the Harpers, you have the Order of the Gauntlet, and Lord's Alliance, and the Emerald Enclave.
Oh, that's pretty good. My Forgotten Realms lore is like Zelch.
And they translate that to the 5 colors in Magic, and they have the dragon that marked houses in Eberron, So, but the realms are the stock setting. So anyway, my point being there are factions, and they've leaned into that a little bit just for organized play. But I think it's really worth playing up the factions as a good way to enshrine differing and cross-odds values. So if you have a Zhentarim in your party who's a mercenary/assassin, and you have a Harper in your party, they're both spies/shadowy people, but they have very different values, so it's easy to get them to work together for certain things, but also in a maybe co-opetitive kind of way, right? They're not always just going to be buddies. That's some of the strongest, I think, gameplay that you're going to get is
that
having
friendly rivalry bit.
My frenemy.
Kind of, yeah.
A party full of some mixture of frenemies.
Yeah, you could do that with more mature players. That kind of devolves to bad murder hoboing and with teenage
with
years.
Teenagers, you can.
Yeah, I remember those days.
What doesn't in teenage years?
Yes, this is true.
Right?
Or kids. Kids are actually the most frightening because they just like murder and hobo like the craziest.
They haven't learned about ethics. Yeah. They don't even know what that is.
It's like rather impressive, actually.
So then the last thing I think that is worth talking about is from a pacing perspective, and this is just a logistics piece about like how to keep the game active, and I think this applies mostly for DMs, but also to players, just paying attention to the amount of time we take up at the table.
Pacing is really everyone's responsibility. It's kind of like fun because it only takes one person to fuck it up.
Right. Some of the things that as a DM I do that help with this, they sort of are transparent, is I will do often what I call micro cliffhangers. So on a given turn, if the player needs to look something up, I will just park them with some cliffhanger and then move on to the next player, and then reorder the initiative I need to later because the player wasn't ready. So they sacrifice their turn.
Yeah,
looking
I've
up
done that before.
Right?
Like you're like, okay, like you forget the words to your spell. We're gonna move you down 5 steps in the 5 in the initiative order, and then we'll come back. We'll get to your turn this round, but it's going to be later in the round because you can't remember the words all of a sudden.
Yeah, I mean,
you don't know what your fucking spell does.
And I would probably not even pick an arbitrary number. I would just say, okay, you're going to wait until you're ready and I'm ready.
Oh yeah, and you can just throw them back in the initiative order, and you don't have to change the permanent position. But
I might not.
Maybe you will,
depending. But
how vindictive are you feeling? Where
I got to about reordering initiative on the fly, and you don't do this if you're out of combat because you can just jump between different players. Is being able to do that for all kinds of things. Like, okay, somebody's rolling a bunch of dice. They have a complicated attack that they're sorting out. When you get really good at this, you can kind of just reorder them on the fly and handle, who's next. Not just on deck, but like the next 3. Maybe you as the DM do some pre-rolling so that when the monsters come around, it's their turn. You do exactly boom, 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 whatever it is. You don't need to take less time, especially if you're the DM because you have a lot of stuff to run, So I think it's a skill, I guess, what I'm getting at, that can be built, managing the pacing and then reordering when people go on the fly, as long as they all get a turn.
To keep the players engaged.
Exactly, to keep everybody engaged. Just to keep it, because if somebody is like taking a while on their turn, they're engaged.
Yeah.
But the other people at the table are not. Right? So let them stay engaged in their process and move on.
Yeah, that's like my favorite strategy. Just move them, have them pop back in the initiative order, and then you can, if you want to flavor it up with an in-game reason, like they can't remember the words of their spell or they fumble with their weapon for a second. You have 6 seconds of round to work with.
Yeah. Somewhere in the 5 to 7, 8 something. Yes, exactly.
Right. It's stuck in the scabbard.
So let's talk about pacing in the adventure itself, right? We're talking about like kind of table pacing and hooking players in the adventure and what makes it good. But I think that there's some part of it that also is in the adventure too and how it's written.
Kind of baked into it, yeah.
Right, and depending on the kind of adventure it is. And you have to think about, from a pacing perspective, the continuity between sessions. So that's like one part, what happened last session, and this is why having memorable encounters and scenarios is really helpful because it anchors it in the players' minds. But also, as you pay attention to, okay, last time we had a big knockdown, drag-out fight on top of a big dam, so we're not going to have another knockdown, drag-out fight on top of another big monument this session. Let's have a little bit of pacing change, so that we did like it's a whole combat, boom, 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 the whole time we were playing. It's just one fight after another. Maybe this time we'll change it up too, so we'll keep it fresh, right?
Yeah, you can get two kind of longer ups and down beats in a longer narrative form. So in like a campaign, like you can have that big battle, and then maybe you have a whole shopping session or something. How does it always take the whole session? And then, and then you get into more of a mix. But yeah, you don't want to keep giving that, like if you had a lot of one experience, it's different than a one shot where you try to keep it a little bit more even keeled all the way through.
Right. As long as when the pace slows down, you don't let it stay slow for too long, right? Like with comedy, the thing that makes it good is the variance. Comedy is really heightened by serious moments and vice versa. Pacing really works well when you have fast-paced, tense moments and then beats of rest. Not just like, okay, you get a long rest, but like, yeah, maybe we're, role-playing for a session or whatever. As long as everybody gets what they want at the table that night, you can have some variance. But I think that also that cuts to a core of how do you manage encounter timing, not just combat encounters, but encounter timing generally. And this is something I struggled with for a long time because I always wanted the encounter to be good and would take as long as I needed to make the encounter be good, hit the note that I wanted, and get the players what they wanted. And I had to reevaluate that when I learned how to run a con game, a convention game, and played within them as well because you have a fixed time slot.
It's more by time.
And this is
an encounter every 40 minutes or something.
Right, and this is exactly how they do it in organized play too for D&D Beyond, and I guess it's the Adventurers League, and Pathfinder Society and others is, they know that the adventure that they're handing you, if you're running that game, is set for a 4-hour time slot. Sometimes it goes to 6. There are X number of encounters, and they expect you to resolve one of the encounters every 40 minutes to an hour. And they've built it that way, and they've measured out the turns for how long it'll take, and average rounds, a monster will survive, and they know that a round takes so long at a table, So thinking, just the act of thinking about that and keeping an eye on the clock as you're running the adventure is immeasurably useful, to be able to know, okay, this was like just a fight they picked at a bar, and already it's taken 40 minutes.
Yeah.
I got to find a way to wrap this up soon,
It's a good skill to form.
Right.
Because you may not always do that at a home game. You may not be under time pressure, so it may not be something you think about.
Maybe. I mean, if you have a long session,
usually
like 8 hours, then maybe you don't.
Yeah, maybe you don't need to worry about it.
All of the games I play now are 4 hours-ish, less really. But
you really don't have as much time to play games as you want, so it's always nice to keep it moving.
Right. Hit the thing you want in the encounter, and then start finding a way out of it as soon as you can. Once you've made that point, now it's like an apex. You build up to it, and then you past it, and you have to just get down.
I think I find really helps with this is being generous with your information flow towards your players, because that way they have the information they need to make go decisions and make plans and do things, and then you get the planning is a little bit less encumbering of the time, and they'll jump into action a little bit more readily.
You almost have to be too generous, tell them multiple times, because humans are humans,
like
and
it
bounces off their head.
You're like, I'm really giving away all these secrets. This is super obvious, but it really helps. Like, there's no point in hoarding the information.
None.
Like, what is it? It doesn't do anything for you unless you give it to the players. It's not even real until the players know it.
So one of the things I like to do for pacing as well, and this is really about stakes management, is thinking about how to keep them high. I like to go straight for the top right at the start, or make it seem that way anyway. Like high stakes, it's life or death, not just life or death. Like, okay, maybe we open there. It's life or death, and also in an earthquake. And then you run that for a little bit. Those are immediately high, like super crazy high stakes. And when the players get a sense for the ground movement mechanics that you've added to this encounter, and they start to look like they're going to win the battle, and they've figured it out and they've solved that puzzle, then raise the stakes again. So not only is it you're in a life or death fight in the middle of an earthquake, but one of the guys just summons a demon and it turns into some awful monster, who starts summoning a meteor from the sky.
Yeah, the boss has at least 3 forms.
Yeah, right. Exactly. You have to raise the stakes again.
I've never got to the end of a JRPG and the boss just has 1 form. No.
And part of it is the fake out, right? This is really in the adventure, and some adventures will give you an obvious stages for a boss or an encounter to set this up, but really when you're running the adventure, it's about knowing how to fake out the players to have them believe, all right, this is it, all right, here I'm going to pull out the stops, and then you stretch them just a little bit further than that with 1, maybe 2 more escalations, and then when they get that victory, it feels hard won. It was a good pace.
You don't want to overdo it though.
No, this is the kind of thing,
or make it feel contrived.
I agree. You don't want to You're not going to be 5 forms to your boss.
Yeah.
You have to read your players.
Yeah. And you can have maybe an enemy resurrects once as a zombie form or something. But if you constantly rely on the same methods to pull that off, unless it's part of the story, it gets a little tired.
Which is why, if it's predictable, then it's no longer the fake out.
Yeah, exactly. Right? Exactly. That's a good point.
That's the point, right? You have to be able to fake them out. So if you're doing the same shtick over and over, but the thing is that these tend to be pretty climactic things. You want to use it to open an adventure. You maybe want to use it at the end of adventure.
Yeah, you don't want to use it as a crutch.
Maybe in the middle of an adventure, and they should be different. You're not going to have one of these every session.
You can't really design memorable. It just kind of has to happen.
You can
design well and hope it goes well enough to be memorable.
And you can learn how to escalate.
Exactly. Well, yeah, that's like you said. You just raise the stakes enough, it probably will end up being memorable.
Right.
Maybe not fun.
I think it depends. You have to know your players. If it's a TPK, well, I hope they like that.
Hey, hardcore man.
But it doesn't have to be harder. Escalation doesn't have to be harder.
That's true. It doesn't have to be through difficulty.
Right. And one of the best ways, I think, to escalate something...
It can even be emotional for the character.
Can be through trade-off. You have to make them make a hard choice. And now they make a hard choice. And then you show them another hard choice that's worse because of the consequences of the last choice.
One of my favorite to mess with is a character's reputation in the game world. Because you're not messing with the player directly, but it's a nice way to get at the character,
Yeah, poke at it.
Give them a mean nickname or something, or
right.
that one's a fun one.
I think I do that as a player a lot. I'll give nicknames to other players' characters because I just think that some names are ridiculous.
It's great. I love it.
So I think that that's basically what there is to say about pacing, keeping the adventure going. But there's more that goes into a good adventure, I think, than just what's in the book or the pace you run it. I think that you also have to include, and this is why I think about the role it serves at our table as a game that we're playing that night, is the experience of the night. What's the immersive experience that you get? And you go online and watch podcasts and vlogs and all this kind of stuff, and there are some people who have fancy Dungeons and Dragons.
A lot of Dwarven Forge equipment.
I'm jealous of some of those people.
It's pretty cool.
But I think
feel better when I look at the price tags, though.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, I'm like, oh my god, that's the most expensive plastic.
That's so much money that I didn't spend. For immersive experiences, I think that one of the cheapest and effective ways that you can do it is with music at the table. And I'm biased, admittedly, because it hooks right into my animal brain, and gives me my soundtrack. Yeah. But I think that this is one of the easy ways that you can make the like sound and smell and senses.
Yeah,
this is part of it too.
I think the important thing to remember with these extra kind of window dressings or icing on the cake kind of stuff is that it's meant to accentuate and supplement the adventure. It will never save a shitty adventure.
Correct.
Don't use this as a crutch. Every now and then that kind of happens. People will fall into using the music or their props or their effects, and it gets to be a little much. You don't need to fully go down that path if your adventure is shaky to begin with.
I mean, if somebody shows up at the table and is LARPing, then I think you have a different conversation to have.
I mean, hey, maybe that's their jam.
Yeah, it's just not D&D.
Yeah.
But I think that's the point of. I mean, some people use candles and lighting.
Some people are super.
What I like about music and why I use it and have used it for a long time at a game is because you can set it and then forget it mostly. It gets out of your way, and you can manage it pretty easily. But it doesn't require that it becomes the focus of the game.
You need to make sure it's like not super repetitive, and then maybe there's some variance. Right. But if you have the right setup, it works pretty well.
What works as good for good music at a table, and what seems like it should but never does, and then how you can quickly filter through it. So some of the best music that there is, I think, at any role-playing game table actually is from video game music, because a lot of video game music is designed to be in the background, out of the way.
While you're adventuring.
Very repetitive while you're adventuring, fighting, running, chasing, exploring, investigating, all of the things that we do in our role-playing games.
But it supports the action.
Right, and it loops usually seamlessly. So you can grab a bunch of this stuff and you can use it for a whole variety of different, And
they're usually longer tracks, which helps with the looping to be less noticeable.
Yeah, exactly. What seems like it should work, but never works, is movie soundtracks.
Those don't work.
It doesn't. They're too. You have too much of a narrative to them.
Sometimes you can pull maybe like a track or two for like a chase scene or a battle scene, but that's about it.
Yeah, maybe. I mean,
because they're usually pretty short tracks.
TV's a little bit easier in some cases, but yeah, you're right. It's like it's hard, and you're right. The TV scene, the fight scene lasts maybe for a minute and a half, 2 minutes, right? Yeah. So the song is going to have a journey that it tells in that minute and a half, 2 minutes, which a fight
it can be pretty intense to listen to that music for 30 minutes.
I know, exactly. The fight's going to last 30 minutes or something, so you want it to at least be like, if you can get it, 3 to 5 minutes, right? So it loops less and has less of an obvious, repetitive, because humans are pattern matching machines. That's our job, right? So we pick it up like that.
I find a strategy that can work is two strategies. One is you can go the playlist method and kind of create a playlist that of songs you might want to use during a particular session. But I think another really smart method to use is to have separate lists for like, all right, this is stuff for in town, this is stuff for battle, this is stuff for exploring, and maybe you do that by like where they are.
Yes to all of the above. I have both of those, and I want to talk about how I filter, because the one that I do the best, I think, is neither of those, and it's that I create a playlist for a campaign, really. Is what it is.
So like a campaign playlist.
That's right, and it has all of the songs in it represent some part of the tone for that campaign. And one of the games I run, I have more generic stuff because it's a more generic style campaign, but even still, you need to filter for like town music, battle music, dungeon music, whatever other kind of music, and you either put it on in the background, and sometimes it's spot on, and sometimes it's not.
Yeah, and sometimes the tone of the scene changes, and then you're like, oh, this music doesn't work anymore.
Right. Which is why I like the campaign playlist, because then I can repeat one song and I know exactly what the one is. I chose it.
Players kind of attach to that motif of that song as well.
It does a service for the adventure, and that it anchors their memories, it anchors their feeling. They go, yeah, okay, I know where I am. I know how it feels. I know how this song makes me feel. But the way to filter it is, and this is just basically like how to get through the slog of listening to a bunch of music that you're going to use at your game. Because
that's my least favorite part of
You're
prep.
Probably not like me that listens to video game music for fun.
I mean, I can, but not actively.
So normally, and here's the secret to it. If you don't like to listen to it, just as like background, you don't have to be like, yeah, I like this song. But like, if it bothers you just to have it on in the background, it's not going to work at your table. Newsflash. So you can rule it out right away. So the way that I often will do it is I'll create maybe, and I have a couple of tools I've used for this. Right now I use Winamp, but I'll create a playlist, and I'm going to say, let's call it Out of the Abyss playlist, because that's one of the ones I'm running. And let's say I get my hands on a new soundtrack. It's 10 songs. I got it from a game maybe or wherever, and I want to know if I can use any of them, and I don't know. I don't want to spend a lot of time doing it. So I load them all up into my media player. I play the first one, and this could be on my phone, or it could be on my computer or whatever, and I'm like doing something. I'm commuting, or I'm cleaning the house, or I'm doing dishes or whatever. And I listen to the first part of it, and if I can't automatically do one of a few things, I skip it. Either one, put it on a playlist because I know where this song goes. In the first 15 seconds, I need to be able to know. Determine that that's A. B, not appropriate, not interested. C, I don't like the song generally, and I'm going to skip it. So within the first few, under a minute, probably under 30 seconds, I know of whether or not I'm going to probably keep this song or skip it. And if it's interesting enough, sometimes I'll encounter a song that I'm like, I don't know where this goes yet. And then I look down and I'm like, wow, I'm a minute and a half into it. Then I'll keep it and decide later because it obviously got me that far. So, but it's really about how to, and there are lots of time, I think there's lots of time in our lives while we have time for this. Like you have to get through and filter it very quickly. So you need to be able to make the call like, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no.
And a lot of time I feel like your gut response to the tone and feel of the music's probably what you're looking for.
It's exactly what
your players are actively listening to it. They're focusing on what's going on at the table.
Yeah, I mean, and that's why I think that filtering it quickly like that into some pre-made playlists it works really well because the music is keyed to our guts. It's keyed to our feelings.
Yeah,
so
it definitely works. I never used music myself until I played in your games, and I was like, wow, when you manage it correctly, because music is another thing to manage, and for some DMs, that's not going to work. It's going to be too much, or like you're going to maybe have players who just find it really distracting.
Sometimes it can be.
So it's definitely something that some groups will like and some groups will hate. But it's something that I've learned to like and use more. I'm not very good at using it, mainly because I don't like to put the time and the work into it. And I kind of go with more of the campaign playlist these days, But it can definitely be like a good mood control kind of thing. And if you have it set up right, it can really be helpful rather than like a hassle.
Agreed. And sound effects too, So
that one I find is just like,
well, there's a couple of distinctions here, and I'll admit, gigabytes of Folly on my computer. I don't use most of it, and I also have a subscription to Sirenscape, which is a sound effects program.
I have a bit of that as well.
So sound effects can do better than music sometimes and worse than music at other times, and there's a few key distinctions, one of which is Folly versus sound effects. And Folly is like footsteps in a background, it's the sound of teacups in a cafe, paper on a table, bus stop, train station going by, all of this kind of stuff. Sound effects are actual things like a laser blast, a sword hitting a shield, clang, a car engine starts as opposed to cars driving by. And sound effects are easy to find, but they're not what you want for the game. Like a car engine start doesn't do very much good at a table. Right, because it plays once.
Unless you got like a soundboard in front of you.
I mean, but then it's not right. Then it's more about the soundboard that you have.
Yeah,
it's not,
exactly.
And it doesn't give you a background sense. Like there's nothing else. It's just the sound of the car starting. But like a freeway passing by, that might be useful because you could play that when the characters, if they're in an urban setting, had one. They come out of a portal and
I just feel like there's so many other things most DMs could focus on more than like getting more nitty gritty with sound effects and Foley.
I don't think you have to get nitty gritty to do it. No, I mean, and this is why I want to talk next about the tools and tricks to do it. So I think video game music is an easy way to hack into it pretty good if you want to go the music route, because a lot of the work has already been done. You can look at the video game, see the tone by watching videos of it on YouTube, not only to hear the music,
the music
and
part,
see what it is.
You don't have as much timing like you do with sound effects.
And then you can get the soundtrack. Sound effects, like I said, I don't think are useful at the game, but Folly is. However, I don't think it's useful necessarily to manage it all yourself. If you're going to, and I've done it, I like Winamp for it because it's the only media player anywhere today that lets you have multiple instances of itself, unless you're running on Linux and are a total Uber nerd, in which case you do you. You're already a total DIY, whatever.
You do whatever you want.
Right. But Winamp lets you say, I'm going to load up a bunch of Folly, and also my music in different playlists at the same time.
Yeah.
And then be able to have like music or switch between layered sound effects, like here's a rain sound effect, and also here's a dragon sound effect, in the background, and lightning or whatever. So it gives you flexibility in like what loops you want to make without a lot of real work. But also Sirenscape is a really good one for that nowadays, and I think it's really worth a lot of its money for the pre-made sound effects. Maybe not the music so much. It's nice that he has
the music doesn't work quite well. I honestly, like, I've had Sirenscape for a while, and I just ended up moving to using music on a Spotify playlist.
Right.
Like, it works fine.
But what I like about Sirenscape is that I can say, like, all right, put together a few different folly tracks for like a marketplace.
Yeah, if you make your own like custom setups on that for what you're doing, it can work pretty well.
Also
because
very
there's
easy
some
to
good,
create a soundscape.
There's some good folly like background tracks.
And, you can use lots of programs for this kind of stuff or wherever your playlist is. VLC, iTunes, doesn't really matter. I've used all of them. I've tried every single one. I came back to Winamp because I like that it can be multiple instances.
Yeah,
and
Winamp's pretty solid.
Looping control. But the Mac version doesn't have any of that stuff, so I don't know what to tell you.
Yeah, I know. I should it's one of those things that if you're feeling pretty comfortable with like everything else you're doing, like you could definitely add a little extra with some music. Like for myself, I could work on the music more, but I know as a DM, I probably need to work at being better on my descriptions. And
your descriptions
my
are fine. You give yourself not enough
that
credit.
I could do better.
I think you give yourself.
The music is like
you should give yourself more
much
credit
extra
for that.
work.
Here's why music I think why I focus so much on it. If I take the Skylar part of it out, because I know it hooks into my limbic system and gives me whatever chills, but music was the thing when I figured out how to do it at the table for an adventure that kicked it up a notch where players started saying, I've never had anybody run a game like that before.
Yeah.
Right? So, and that's what makes the adventure really...
Definitely adds a layer of drama.
They remember it, and they start to feed into it.
I remembered it because I was like, wow,
it.
This is the first time I've seen music really work how I always imagined it could work in a game, which was cool.
Right.
Because it doesn't work when you're trying to be like, ooh, spooky.
No.
It's like no one at the table is scared.
Candles don't work either.
No, you can't do...
Flickering lights doesn't work either.
No, you're just not going to get horror like that in the game.
So... okay, I think the last thing to talk about is how to end an adventure. And this is oftentimes one of the scariest, hardest parts of running an adventure or designing an adventure. I think it's worth making a note here that there are both climaxes and anticlimaxes. And, the climax is, of course, the pinnacle. It's the most critical moment of the adventure. It's where the heroes or protagonists do actually pull off whatever it is that was at risk, saving town, saving the world, stopping Tiamat, whatever it is.
Or utterly failing.
Or utterly failing and the world is ended, And then also there's an anticlimax, which is, anticlimactic. It's like, we didn't encounter Tiamat because something else went wrong. And
the party wanted to open a tavern.
We went, exactly. The party wanted to open a tavern instead and now are selling beers to followers of the Dragon Queen. Okay. And if they're very satisfied with that may also be a very humorous ending. Sometimes stories go that way and it's okay. But I think that it's worth being aware of what one you're aiming for in the adventure and which one the adventure lends itself to. But also I want to talk, if we're talking about endings, you can't talk about endings without the structure of the adventure. And here I think it's useful to look at the two broad categories that I see in how stories progress. And it doesn't have not just like improv stories, not just ad hoc stories like an adventure, also TV, all of it. And the sort of Western model is the 3-act model, right? Act A, Act B, Act C. Act A opens a bunch of stuff, exposition, and the core of the conflict is set up at the end of Act A. Act B, things get worse and really bad until it's really desperate at the end of Act B, and then there's a shift. And Act C, everything is resolved, and there's probably a denouement, right? The coming down after the
Rising
climax.
action, falling action,
epilogue,
all that.
Right. Versus in the Japanese style, particularly Kurosawa was famous for making movies about this, it's a more of a pacing difference. They don't have a 3-act style. The tension goes slow, 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 faster, faster, faster until you get to the end of the story. And at the very end of the story, it's the fastest! And then it ends. And that sudden ending, that's it. That's the end of the story right there. Is, also very potent and leaves the audience walking away going,
This is true.
So adventures can do both, right? They can be either one of these. It's useful to think about which one you want to run.
And usually the kind of scope of the adventure kind of matters for this.
Right. The final climax will be in one or the other, like a climax with an epilogue, Western style, or just the climax is it, Eastern style.
How many sessions you're doing also, you can't Kurosawa every session.
Right. Like 3 hours long.
You could.
So
the session would have to be much longer.
That'll give you closure for the story, which we as humans like, right? When we read a book or see a TV series, most people look at that and they go, "Oh, that had a nice arc. It had some closure. I like the pacing of it. I like where the story went." We look for that. Also, all of us are looking for closure for the characters who are in the story too. And I think that as you're running an adventure, and both as a player too, it's useful to think about two different types, broadly, that there are of types of characters, possible characters that can be. And they are either dramatic heroes or characters and iconic heroes or characters. And the difference is basically boils down to, does the character change or not at the end of the story? So a dramatic hero or character is one that goes through whatever the ordeals are of the adventure, the story, and then comes out different, learns something. Things are changed. The world is not the same for that person. It's new. It's worse or better, or who knows. And an iconic character, by contrast, has a worldview, has the worldview challenged through the course of the adventure, and then reaffirms that worldview through success at the end of the adventure.
And you have the same setup for villains as well. You have the villain who wants to keep the status quo, right? Keep the people under his heel. And then you have the villain who wants to change everything, take over the world. And it's funny, people tend to really drive more towards the dynamic characters that want to change things.
Yeah, I mean,
generally,
I think that's
those
where,
tend to be the more popular characters.
That's where the zeitgeist is today. So let's provide some easy examples. In the modern incarnation, Steve Rogers' version of Captain America is a dramatic hero. At the end of Captain America, the first Avenger, he learns something, he changes, and he has learned about the role of himself in this world larger than himself. And that makes him decide something quite powerful at the end. By contrast, Captain Marvel is an iconic character. She has a belief at the outset of the story, and she is challenged by those who built her, and then she reaffirms that belief at the end of the story and is exactly who she was at the very start. And we're glad for it. There's neither one that's better than the other. But it's useful for everybody at the table because now you know what kinds of things are going to be satisfying to that character. A dramatic character, a player who's having that, is going to look for some change to happen in their character. An iconic character has a statement that they're seeking to validate.
The nice thing is you can talk about this with your players on the player level.
Yes, exactly.
Especially if they know it's a one-shot or it's going to be the last session. You're like, you can talk. Don't be afraid to talk to your players on a player level and be like, hey, so how do you see this character ending? Or like maybe they want to do a scene. You're like, all right, show us where does this character end up? And they can kind of take narrative control and give you a little scene or a little montage or an epilogue or something.
Right. So, the end of the adventure is when if you haven't gotten it, this is the time to do it for that character. You don't have to happen at the end. It can happen sooner for sure. But it's definitely the most powerful moment in which to do that. And it's where you want to make sure that closure has happened.
To happen on screen. Like, I'm sure there's groups where they'll be content just talking about it.
That's right.
And everyone will be there listening, and that's all they'll have to do.
Exactly.
You have other groups who want to play it out. It's going to change. It's going to be dependent on the players.
Mostly it actually, I think, is that the story ends because of the sort of first draft nature of role-playing games, tabletop role-playing games. The story ends, the adventure ends, you're done with it, and then you talk about it afterwards.
It's really, it's more the talking afterwards where the story emerges, where maybe a lot of those details are kind of like, oh, yeah.
That really is like closure for the players. We're the audience and the players, and I mean players both here at the table, but also in the theatrical sense, because that's very much how I view it.
Yeah.
And that's like getting just desserts or justice, desserts for all of the people who we as the audience want to get it. Tying up whatever loose threads need to be tied up just so that we, because we're going to think about it. We automatically do. Our imaginations are going to run wild, so being able to know what are the things. Well, what about that guy that we let live? Oh, back 8 levels ago.
And that's when the author's like, I'm doing another book.
And that's why it's useful sometimes
It's kind of interesting, because you kind of see why people come back to do sequels or other things, because that kind of those little questions eat away at their mind. Like, but what happened to that character? What did he do after that? I got to know.
So it's useful,
especially discovery writers.
It's useful to be intentional about what loose ends you leave. And I think that not every adventure does this. A lot of times in the adventure you'll see conclusions or continuing adventures at the very end of it, or next steps.
I really like it when I've noticed in a lot of the adventures I've used recently, it will give you the option, because maybe it's a chain. It's like, if you're just playing this adventure and you're going to end it here, make sure you talk with your players and get them a satisfying ending to their character. And the other one, it'll say, if you're going to continue, probably look at doing these kind of things. It'll lead well into the next adventure in this path.
Right. So, like with all things in this game, but especially the endings, a little bit of forethought goes a long way here. It really helps the players, all of them, DM included, feel good about how they've just spent a whole bunch of their time.
One of the first things I do when I get an adventure is read what happens at the end. so I kind of know where we're going.
Right. The caveat is it's hard to talk about the end with your players because spoilers, you know?
You just got to make sure you're not...
This is why I find it useful really to talk about the types of characters that there are, dramatic and iconic, because that's like a note-passing way to talk about where the story goes, you know? I think that's it. I don't think there's any more I have to say about what makes a good adventure.
No, that's pretty much it. Good adventure. It's a tough thing to brew up.
It has been a good adventure.
It's definitely probably the hardest thing I think to do well in RPGs.
That's definitely true.
To those who write them, thank you.
Hear, hear. All right. Until next time.
We'll see ya.